welcome to Cracks in the Cement. I'm your host, Ronan. Today we have our first guest. I'm so excited. Jen is from Portland and they are here to talk about the work they do. We had tea a couple weeks ago and just had a really great conversation. So thank you so much, Jen, for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Mhm. So Jen is a queer and trans coach and bodywork practitioner, passionate about helping people come home to their bodies, their pleasure, and their power. At Wild Root Revival, they offer somatic homecoming and liberation practices designed to help folks enhance their ability to be in and aware of their bodies, ground in their curiosity, cultivate intimacy, and amplify both their pleasure and their voice. Jen especially loves facilitating clients' explorations with gender and embodiment, libido and pleasure practices, belonging and grief. Jen's own homecoming practices include lots of river time, friendship adventures, sexy, kinky, geeky pleasure practices, intimacies with grief, and all the trans community they can find. They have certifications in embodied sex coaching, sexological bodywork, and psychedelic integration coaching. And they can be found at www.wildrootrevival.com or on Instagram at wildrootrevival. And I will put the links, if you're listening to this, you can find the links in the description. And if you're watching this, you can also find the links in the description. Um, Jen, to summarize, is awesome. And there's so many things to talk about. Um, so just to warm us up here before we get into the nitty gritty, we're going to be talking about, just if, for those of you trying to decide if you want to keep listening, we'll be talking about consent and kind of like this leveling up of consent. It feels like we're being invited into. And also, we'll be talking about, for both of us, we've kind of come into our full queerness a little later in life than some of you amazing younger folks. So we'll be talking a little bit about that. Yeah, so just to get us warmed up, I would love to hear, and this is a question that somebody gave me that I just kind of felt sort of energizing and what we're in right now, which is, what is something that gives you faith and hope in humanity right now?
Hmm. That's such a good question. I think one of the things is just the diversity of response to hardship. I'm just really, that's fascinated by it, but also really reassured often by how many creative ways, and sometimes just not creative ways, we're meeting, challenging moments. And to talk with people across the spectrum from like, I've just been under the covers for a few days, taking care of myself in that way, to like, yeah, I just started an entirely new organizing group to approach this one specific issue. There's such a range of approaches and energies being brought, and I just appreciate the quiet ones and the vibrant ones. And it makes me feel like I have so many options my own self, and I get to pick the ones that feel right for me.
I love that. It's
Yeah.
really making me think how it feels like we're all really coming into how we're part of this puzzle, like a collective puzzle,
Yeah.
that we don't all need to do all the same things at the exact same time, and that doesn't work.
Right. Yeah.
That's
Yeah. I think
beautiful.
that's what comes to mind today. I think that every day I have a different a different answer to that question, probably. But today that's the one.
I love that. Thank you.
Mm.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I guess, and as this being my first interview, I've been listening to other podcasters, doing interviews and noticing the different styles. And some of the interviewers hardly share anything, and it's just really just holding the stage for the guest. And then others,
Yeah.
it's almost like voyeurism. You're just kind of watching it. So I think I'm kind of want to walk the line of sort of in the middle of,
Yeah.
I'd like to mostly listen to what you have to share,
Mm.
and also just give a little bit. And for me, when I was asked that question, the thing that popped into my head was, I was invited to see Hadestown. It's a Broadway show that was traveling through Eugene, and it was a free invitation. It was this incredible, incredible musical performance, like Broadway, brilliant, incredible story. And that's what popped into my head, was just thinking about, all the music and art And like you're saying, it when it was speaking to capitalism through this fable. Um, but yeah, just
Yeah.
it's
And I'm
cool.
glad you named because I was thinking about, I wanted to know your answer to that question, but I also didn't know what your style of podcasting was. So thanks for just popping that right in there, right when I wanted it.
Yeah, okay, I'm glad that worked.
Yeah.
Um, well, so I really would love you to talk more about what you do and maybe even a few examples of why folks might come to you. It's so interesting, the different, like the psychedelics mixed with the body work and stuff that you do.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity to do that. I do have kind of an interesting cluster of things that I work with people around. Most of the people that come to me um, around issues like I have a hard time staying in my body or being present when I'm being intimate with my partner or having sexual function issues. A lot of folks who are kind of exploring what their gender means and how their body and their gender, kind of come together, how to embody their gender, really. And I do have some folks who've been doing psychedelic journeying with another practitioner or on their own who are just unsure how to integrate all of that experience and how to actually make change in their life, um, when it's appropriate after those experiences. So often I'm finding that the work is very similar, regardless of the issue, that we're really looking to the body to kind of help inform how we exist in different circumstances, help in our decision making, but also importantly, like how to be home in yourself, how to trust yourself and have faith in yourself that you're going to honor what's true for you, that you'll be able to know what's true for you. And I find that that is an important skill, regardless of why you might be coming to me.
Mhm. Mm. And you shared a little bit this with me when we got tea together. Do you feel like sharing a little bit how you got to do that work? Because I feel like
Mhm.
that is such a great, like I can really feel the work you do through that
Sure.
story.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Um, so I used to fit really well into the machine of this society. I had a corporate job and I did it really, really well. That was a big part of my identity, that and being a parent. And then I lost some family members to violence about 6 years ago, and it was, sudden and shocking and really life changing. So as part of that experience, developed PTSD and had to really understand, like, who am I actually? A lot of my ideas of myself and the stories I told myself about myself really disintegrated. I didn't understand how my brain worked anymore. I knew for the first time in my life that I really needed to attend to my body, and I'd never really done that well before. But the shock and the trauma was such a physical experience that I had to, like, that was one of the first things I did was I found a massage therapist who worked with people who were in trauma actively. It's one of the best things I ever did. Um, and so it really shifted all of the axes of my life very quickly. And I spent a lot of time just trying to figure out how to be in my own skin, like how to move, like literally physically move was everything felt strange and new. Um, and so I was doing a lot of research around how to work with PTSD. I was reading a lot of articles and I kept coming over and over again across articles about MDMA work with trauma patients within mental health care settings. And that wasn't something that was available in Oregon at the time, but I had had experience with MDMA when I was in my 20s. And I was like, I always liked that. I was like, I can access that space pretty comfortably, I felt. And so I started going to the woods with a trusted friend and doing some MDMA maybe once every 3 or 4 months. And it really helped me find my way through my grief. Um, and what became really clear to me was that while that was for certain the worst experience of my life to date, it also ended up kind of being the best experience of my life in terms of what it created space for me to discover and explore about what it means to be alive. And one of those things I discovered was, just a lot of physicality, a lot of like learning how to breathe well and learning how to, be in relationship with my body. Um, and I had a really big experience in the woods one time and came out pretty intensely vibrating for about a month. And as part of that process, started really recognizing that I had some work to do around my sexual body. And I started looking for somebody to help me with that because it was a time in my life where I really sought wisdom from others and, worked with a lot of different kinds of folks in a lot of fields just to figure myself out. And as part of that research, I found sexological bodywork. And as I was reading about it, I was like, this is me. This is how I think about a lot of things. This is kind of how I operate in relationships a little bit. I can recognize a lot of it, and it felt like home to me. So I had been in a psychedelic integration coaching program kind of as a result of everything I had learned on my own path with psychedelics. And then that also had led me to this work as a sexological body worker. So I really started all of this work um, with grief and working with grief. And I think that's appropriate because so much of what we find in psychedelics and in working with the body is grief. There's joy and pleasure, and alongside of that, there's often a grief that comes with the suffering we've endured or the ways we haven't known ourselves, big griefs and subtle griefs. And so I think having facility for that and having comfort with grief is important in the work that I do and the way that I do it. Not everybody in my field does that, but a lot of us have that recognition.
And you said when you first found the sexological, what's the word, therapy or
Body work.
body work, and you said
Yeah.
that's you. What does that
Mm.
mean? Like, what did you see in that in yourself?
Yeah, I just suddenly flashed back to a lot of relationships I had been in where I would recognize something in my partner that maybe they knew or maybe they didn't quite see in themselves and would often issue kind of an invitation to explore that thing. Do you feel comfortable um, taking your clothes off, during sex? And if not, would you like to, see what we could do with that? Would you like to explore that a little bit? Or I've noticed that you have, kind of a little bit of a natural dominance here. Is that something you've ever explored? Is that something you're curious to explore? So I'm a very curious person. I'm a very curious partner. And so I had been kind of, you know, inviting these explorations in my relationships for a long time. And the idea of having an opportunity to do that with people who I wasn't in relationship with felt like a really sweet piece of work. I was really excited to explore.
That's so cool. And it's making me think of like internal family systems or something where
Mm,
it's like there you weren't expecting your partner to fit into a certain box. You were
right.
accepting who they were and then rolling with that.
Yeah.
No bad parts, so to speak.
Yeah, no bad parts. And I'm I think that it's what I find interesting about working with the body is that parts parts work comes in it almost automatically. I'm not an internal family systems practitioner, but I have like enough familiarity with it from my own work to recognize when there are parts at play. And somatic work often brings forward parts. So I think there's an interesting symbiosis between those two kinds of work.
I mean, it just seems I've come to feel like there's nothing that we can move forward on or evolve into without exactly what you're doing. It's just absolutely needed.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
cool. I'm curious how also coming into your full queerness, like how did that kind of
Mm.
interweave with all of this?
Yeah, so I came to my queerness in my early 40s, so before all of this started. Um, and then I came to my transness like a lot of folks did in the lockdown phase of COVID. I think we're all, having a lot of time with ourselves, and there was a lot of opportunity to reflect and recognize. And I think as the like structural systems of society get a little shaky, it gives you an opportunity to question all the structures of your life and of, like the society, like the way you fit in society. So I'm not at all surprised to hear so many stories of people kind of, having their egg crack moment during lockdown. And that was true for me as well. Um, and so I think that, the way that that weaves into this work for me is like I love to work within my own community. I do work with folks who are not queer and trans, but the majority of people who seek me out are queer and trans. And I think that's really important that we have, safe places or safer places for us to explore tender things. And so it's like an honor and privilege of my life to create a room for people to have these really vulnerable explorations, especially when the world gets extra chaotic or feels dangerous to us. I think that's even more important.
And having that shared experience of,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, I think
Mm.
it's interesting, especially because the way I identify, if I'm being political about if I want to be visible and I want to increase other people's visibility, I'll say that I'm bisexual. It's the umbrella I live within, I live under. And I'll say that I'm trans. And if I want people to really know me, then I'll say that I'm non-binary or genderqueer. Um, and as far as my gender, and that I'm omnisexual as far as my sexuality, which for me means that I'm attracted to people of many genders and gender presentations, but that gender is actually an important part of my attraction. Whereas pansexual people will say gender is not a thing, like it's the person, not the gender, and that's not me at all. Um, and so I think that one of the interesting things, it's hard to come out later in life. There are wonderful things about it and hard things about it. And I think it might be a little extra hard to come out underneath the bi umbrella than it is to come out as like, okay, now I'm lesbian as opposed to a straight person. Just because there's a lot of biphobia in queer community. So that's an added piece to come in later and then to be by like exacerbates the not enoughness that I think is endemic in queer and trans community. And I think when you come in later in life, that not enoughness is a really big thing to battle against. So I think that's the thing to work with and through.
Yeah, I feel that. Um,
Mm,
I'm curious when you say gender does matter. I know that for me, um, sex and being in like sexual relationships, gender is important to me as far as like I really like playing with the different kind of dynamics of
yeah,
like I'm kind of switchy, but I tend to be topish and I like playing with that energy. And if I were with
mm,
somebody who was fully as top as me, that
mm,
energy, like the energy that I like to dwell
right.
in would go away. So I'm curious, is it similar for you?
Isn't that interesting how it's such like there's so many layers. There's like bodies, there's power dynamics and the way we think of power dynamics and how we tend to associate those with genders, the top bottom and dom sub. And then there's, gender, like how a person feels in themselves and how that can be attractive too. So it can be really hard to tease apart sometimes. For me, I notice that um, and I have these little charts that are like my attraction set at different age, like different um, decades of my age and how it's changed over time, which has been, I'm like a little bit of a data geek. That was really fun to chart out. Um, and it started like very much focused on masculinity. So masculinity of just cis men. And then it expanded to like, oh, masculinity across any gender I find really hot. And then it was like an androgyny too. And then like sometimes it's femininity, but also especially if somebody is trans or non-binary or masculine, but not so much femininity with cis women. And so that's kind of been the evolution in conversation. I feel like by the time I die, I'll just be like, everybody's hot specifically because of their gender and how they do gender, right? So it's expanding quite a bit over the years. But that where somebody sits on that spectrum, and I'm not sure it's a linear spectrum, but of like masculinity, femininity, and androgyny, like that's kind of where I get really intrigued.
I see.
Yeah.
And as far as like mapping that over the course of your life, do you ever go back and think, if conditioning hadn't have been pushed upon you?
Mm,
And I'm the same as you as far as like
mm,
I bisexual is kind of like the easiest for if I'm
mm,
speaking to like kind of just exactly like what you were saying. Um, and if you are bisexual, like if you can't, if like as a female bodied person, being socialized as a girl, if I could find attraction to a cis man, that was easier on me. It was more in the flow of the propaganda I was receiving, the way my parents,
Right.
we kind of get nudged. Do you ever
Mhm.
like think about if you hadn't have had that, which direction you might have gone? Would you have ended up
Yeah,
married to a cis man?
I I don't know. And I think there's that natural thing that happens when you come to your sexuality late and people assume that you just didn't recognize it or you're suppressing it. I don't know that I fully believe that that's true for me. I mean, looking back, there is like that one person in high school that I'm like, I was really fascinated with that person. And maybe that was, not as platonic as I assumed it was. So I do have like little things here and there where I, recognize um, the potential of some of that being present for me throughout my life. Um, and also like even since I've been out, like it still changes. So I really believe also that it can be an evolutionary experience within the course of your life. And so I also hesitate to kind of put that narrative on people that, well, you just, weren't paying attention or you were, kind of um, just doing what you were led to believe was the right thing to do. That can definitely be true. Um, and also doesn't necessarily need to be true.
And that's something I guess you could apply to every human being, and who knows who we would be if,
Right.
with anything, if we hadn't have been squished. And
Mhm.
yeah, I totally hear that. It's like, what's the point?
Right.
And then the one other layer that I've also been curious about is sometimes I think the men that I found hot, part of it is that I wanted to be that man, which I
Oh
think
yeah.
is really interesting too.
Right. Yeah. I um I have this little joke, which is like, do I want to fuck it or do I want to be it? Like, which is it? I don't know. Like, I'm really attracted. Why? Sometimes it's all of the above. Often it's all of the above. But yeah, I think that especially when you have a gender conversation that you're having with yourself, um, teasing those things apart can be really fascinating and intriguing. And also sometimes I just land with, like you just said, doesn't matter. And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes no. I think also as I'm aging and my body changes as I age, teasing apart gender in relation to age and like body weight, for example, for me, trying to make sure that the way I feel about my gender is actually the way I feel about my gender and not about how my body is changing and the body that, like, is this the body that I want and that I feel? And is that because of gender or is that because like everything's changing in ways that are new and not always comfortable? That's been an interesting thing to kind of navigate as well. So I love, the inquiry. I love the exploration, and it's not always an easy one.
Yeah, I feel that too. And these are variables that is it even worth trying to tease apart? Like, the way
Right.
you said, it's an evolution exploration.
Yeah,
And it feels like for me, the thing I'm most grateful for is just being open to it all
absolutely.
and just, having fun with it and letting it be and having it be respectful, which is kind of like flowing us into the other topic here. I was really hoping to dig in here, which is consent. And the reason that I had, when we had met, I brought it up partially because some of the things you had shared made me think about there's been some like wounding and in
Mhm.
my community and in my own exploration. So I have a cis man spouse, and I've come into my queerness. When we came together, he knew that I had had sexual relationships with cis women. He knew that I was bisexual. Um,
Nice
but
air
I had
quotes.
always, what's that?
I said nice air quotes.
But I'd always in my life, my relationships had leaned towards cis men. Most of my relationships had been that way. So I seemed like a
Yeah.
safe bet. And then
Yeah.
and I'm 50, and as I've started to go through menopause and stuff like that, I think totally taking away any instincts to procreate has kind of given me this more like I started to be like,
Yeah.
honey, I'm feeling really gay. Like I'm having a lot of gay thoughts here. And so, and it's been really hard and beautiful. And it's helped us really evolve into this queer relationship. And part of that was doing a little bit of opening our marriage so that I could express that part of myself with a female bodied person. And so in going through that, we end up learning about like the consent lists, or you had called it like an inventory, where even before I started a sexual relationship with another person, all parties involved knew like what was it that I was okay with doing, I was okay with receiving, what she was okay with doing, what she was okay with receiving, what our two spouses were okay. You know, it was this whole thing that we went through before we even kissed. And so and then witnessing some friends being in relationships like polyamorous relationships where those lists weren't used, where um it's the person thought there was consent and then later found out actually it really wasn't. And then how do we, and then as we had talked a little bit before we hit record here, how does that relate to, we hear a lot of talk around what's a full-bodied yes to anything, signing up for a course, taking a new job, you know, um how do we kind of like align maybe what our cognition says, yeah, I'm okay with that, and then but what is our body, how does it
Yeah.
feel? And so, yeah, and you'd shared with me some definitions of different kinds of consent, like
Yeah.
neutrality, I think. Anyway, so
Yeah.
just kind of open up that can of worms, consent.
Sure. Yeah, consent's the way I practice consent, I call it embodied consent. It's kind of a mishmash of a couple different terms in my field. And a lot of people in the work that I do study under Betty Martin or study Betty Martin's work. Betty Martin wrote The Wheel of Consent. And so her work informs a lot of the way that I approach this. And I just feel it's important to honor that. Um, and I think that, so the way that I think about consent is, like using the body as the body's an amazing data collection system. It's giving us so much data if we are hearing it, right? And a lot of Western culture is like this hierarchical nature, like everything up here is valuable and everything below here is like just the worker. Like this is just, it's very, it's a very kind of capitalist, like this is the control and this is, just the function. Um, and that is actually like strips away from us so much of the information that can help us make our decisions and know ourselves because the body is collecting data all day, every day and wants to share it up. And if our brain's not listening to it, our mind, our brain, however you want to think about that, then we're losing a lot of information that could be really helpful. And a lot of us aren't super comfortable with what our body's telling us or giving us. It can be overwhelming. If we have trauma, we may have just shut it down altogether. And so, part of the work of embodied consent is to see, like, can I even feel my body? Can I even recognize what my body is saying? When I do feel it, do I know what that means? And so the work of embodied consent is really around like turning those systems all back on and getting that communication flowing again in a way that you can recognize and then, take action on, like make decisions with. Um, and I think it's, we tend to think of consent in this country as, primarily around sex. And I think that doing this work, you recognize pretty quickly that consent is a factor in every aspect of our lives. Like, are we in consent when our mom wants us to like come over, spend our Friday night with her doing this like canning project or something? Or are we in consent when our boss asks us to do this project? Or when our kids demand something or our partner demands something outside the realm of, what we're doing sexually. And so I think, kind of moving toward an embodied consent approach gives us an awful lot of support in all of the decision-making areas of our life. And I think also it's an important way to kind of rebuild trust with our body. So, especially if we've ever had any consent violations or any agency and sovereignty violations, there's a lot of trust rupture just within our own ecosystem. And so embodied consent work can start to help us rebuild that. So when I work with clients, especially with anything body or pleasure related, embodied consent is where we start every time. And what that looks like is a little bit of sensate focus practice. And sensate focus is like, can you even notice sensations? So, um, if you're touching an object, what do you notice about that object? What do you notice about how that object makes your hand feel? So sensate focus is a lot of like being able to narrow your focus down and really notice what sensations happen. That's foundational because embodied consent is then around noticing what's happening in the body and figuring out like what is it telling you. So you want to practice something?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you a few questions. They'll be may I or will you questions. And you don't have to answer. You just notice what's happening in your body as I say these things out loud. Um, okay. So the first thing I'll say is, will you put the palm of your hand to my hand and hold it there for 4 seconds? May I squeeze your shoulder gently, gentle pressure for just a few seconds? May I give you a hug? Will you give me a hug? May I stick my wet finger in your ear and move it around? And so, if I ask these questions, did you have any things in your body that you noticed?
Um, well, the most basic is kind of like a bringing in, like it
Mhm.
felt like an openness.
Yeah.
And then the finger in the ear, it was almost, I mean, it was such an incredible
Mm.
close. Like, nope. Like
Yeah.
it felt like like a closing.
Right.
Almost, yeah, like a push, yeah, pushing away. I could feel
Uh,
it energetically.
yeah. Yeah. So this is a way um, to kind of notice like what's happening in the body when somebody asks you a thing that you're like really into. Often it's like an opening of the chest or leaning forward, like an excited bubbliness. And like sometimes people describe it as like a little bit of bubbliness in the chest or the stomach, but like an excited kind. Sometimes the face will, relax or smile. So those are like data points, right? Um, and then if it's a no, often that feels uh like a you'll actually sometimes see people like lean back or kind of move away. It can be a bracing of muscles or a churning in the stomach. Um, you know, any kind of those are like more like stress responses, right? Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes you don't really have a lot of information. And so embodied consent also teaches us to slow down and tune in and not answer so quickly, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so once you start to notice through practice, like, oh, this is what a no feels like in my body, or this is what a yes feels like, then you have the opportunity through the course of your life and your day to notice. Like, if you have a decision point or somebody asks you a question, do you want to go for a walk? You can kind of like tune in and see what's your body saying, not just what's your mind saying. And if you notice dissonance, between my mind says, yes, like obviously I want to go for a walk, but my body's actually feeling kind of hesitant, then you have the opportunity to make a decision. Do you go for the walk anyway? Do you say, actually, I don't want to go for a walk, or can we like walk this way? Because I don't like it when we walk this way. And so it gives you an opportunity to make better choices for yourself. Um, and that's applicable to everything, right? And every time we make a choice that's out of alignment with our actual like somatic yes or no, we also have an opportunity to have a conversation with ourselves about that, to name that there's the dissonance, to kind of even sometimes explain to ourselves, like, I'm going to make this choice. I know I can see this as a no, but I'm still going to go on this walk because I can like make space for that with this person because they really need it. I'm going to override my no in this case for this reason. And here's how I'm going to take care of myself afterwards or during, right? And that's a really simple example, but that can happen in big ways too. And I think we're kind of moving into a period of time in our country where we might find that happening a lot. So I work a job that is really not healthy for me. Um, and I'm still going to work that job unless I can find another one because of food security or housing security. Like that's a classic example of where you do a thing that you're really not in consent about because you need to. You've made a decision that that food security, housing security is more important than that dissonance in your body, but you can still attend to that by naming it by explaining to your own self. I do a lot of talking to my body, kind of explaining to your own ecosystem, like, yes, I recognize this is not what's good for us, and here's why we're doing it, and here's how, I'm going to be taking care of myself through this, strain, this, kind of challenging conflict between what I need and what I'm going to do. And so embodied consent doesn't mean like you're always in consent. Um, I think in wellness work, you see a lot of like purity inclinations, like, you always have to be perfect about the way you approach your own health and wellness. And I think that's a trap. I think that, kind of that's just an opportunity for us to shame ourselves about, real scenarios that aren't always going to be perfect. Um, so that's kind of a summary of embodied consent. And I'm happy to pause there and see if you have questions.
I really like how I feel like you take it one step further or farther. Because I was gonna ask you about that. Like with sex,
Mm,
it feels really important to listen to if what if it's a
right.
full body embodied consent, 100% yes. But
Yeah.
like you're saying, canning with moms, sometimes we have to do things we don't really want to do. But what I really love that you take it one step farther, which is
Mm,
what am I going to do for myself after? I know it's going to be really fucking draining
right.
and I'm going to be pissed off and she's going to misgender me the whole time, not use
Right.
my name,
Yeah.
but this is what I'm going to do afterwards to care for myself. And then the other thing
Yeah.
I really want to add in here that really has to do with the work that I do, and then also just speaking to the little exercise you did with me, is being somebody who is a little neuro whatever,
Yeah.
undiagnosed, but right away I'm like, is that normal? Is that what I'm supposed to do? Is that okay? Like
Mm,
I'm like, is that what I'm supposed to do?
yeah.
And so that extra layer of when sometimes social things don't come supernatural to us, and
Hmm.
and so it's like what might seem natural to me might seem really fucking weird, and so
Right.
and then also the layer of being a white person.
Mm,
So like thinking about, even though I know white fragility is actually very violent and all that, there is, that whole like lack of emotional resiliency or something like that,
mm,
like paying attention to, for me, I have to pay attention to the way I interpret the world because of how my brain works, and then how whiteness informs what feels
mm,
comfortable to me or not.
hmm.
So it's complicated.
Yeah. And I think it's important to interrogate ourselves, right? And sometimes you can do that gently, and sometimes it's not going to be very gentle. And there are times when that's appropriate, right? As much as possible, we take care of ourselves. If we're not taking care of ourselves, then we're not able to show up in the conversations that need to be had or the actions and activism that needs to happen. And sometimes it's going to be really uncomfortable, and that's okay. And I think a lot of the way I think about this work is somewhat informed by that process of grieving that I was describing earlier, because in that process, and especially in the immediate aftermath of losing this part of my family, um, I could see how much my body was taking care of me. Like I was in an extreme circumstance, and any moment that I wasn't required to be present, I would go to sleep like I had narcolepsy. My body would just be like, okay, they're done. They need a break. And then if there was something happening in the environment where I needed to be awake, it would just bring me back awake. And I was like, damn, like my ecosystem is working so hard. My mind body ecosystem is working so hard to keep me whole right now, as whole as I can be in this moment, to help me survive this moment. And that I've been an anxious person my whole life. I've been pretty anxious. And that gave me so much trust in myself and faith in my ability to meet a moment. There were so many experiences in that process where, you know, I was doing things I never thought I could do. I never knew I had it. And that was powerful. And I think that embodied consent is in part about building that trust. I think we don't often believe that we'll know what we need, who we are, what we can do. Embodied consent starts to help you know yourself. I think that's an important part of it. And then it helps you start to develop the ability to speak to what you know and to say those things out loud, to risk reactions that aren't always going to be favorable about those things, and tolerate the discomfort of that, of the knowing, first of all, and the communication about the knowing. Um, and so, I'm always encouraging my clients to go at their own pace. If going at their own pace means they discover that they're out of consent and they cannot handle figuring that out right now, that's okay. Then we look at how do you hold yourself knowing you're out of consent? How do you start to shore yourself up so that one day you can address it? Um, and if somebody's like, yeah, I've got the energy and the resilience right now to deal with this, then how do you learn to tolerate being in situations that are uncomfortable, painful, really challenging, you know, existentially shifting, right? Like maybe you're ending a relationship, maybe you're moving across the country, maybe you're leaving the country. Um, and so how do you hold yourself in these moments, and how do you like really trust yourself that you'll be able to meet that moment? I think the other piece about that experience of grief for me was I got real comfortable with the idea of death, and it didn't frighten me as much as I think it had before then. And that's really freeing, because like that's kind of a thing that, you know, this, idea that if we make a mistake, we could die. If you take that out of the equation, then there's a lot more freedom to make mistakes. Um, a lot of the work I do really is around repairing um, issues of belonging. And so that is almost a risk greater than death for most of us. The idea that, and existentially, like if you go back in time to like small communities and nature is hard to survive on your own, being banished is a direct existential threat. And that still holds, like in our genetics and in our sense of ourselves, the idea of not being welcome, the idea of not being seen and allowed to be within, is a really hard thing. It's the thing that I think drives most of our quietness and our keeping ourselves to ourselves. Most, not most, I would say 70% of my clients are neurodivergent, which maybe that equates to most. Um, and so I think we have a lot of conversations around um, trusting that you know who you are and deciding when to be mask on and when to be mask off. And I think that's the biggest piece, right? Like this is all sovereignty stuff. You get to decide how you move through the world. And hopefully you're deciding how you move through the world based on what you know of yourself and based on your understanding of the circumstances within which you're acting and being. Um, so yeah, that's juicy. It's not always easy, and it's worth it.
Mm, that is such good stuff. Great answer. I love it.
Yeah, I love talking about this. It's all like, it's all liberation.
Yeah.
It's liberatory work.
Um, Making sure that we have enough time here,
Yeah.
I'd love to talk about our last thing on our list here was, and totally related, but you're just talking about how do we, these are your words from a
Mm.
text, we're interacting here. How do we attend to ourselves after a consent rupture? So
Yeah.
maybe, and as I've shared with you, just having folks being like, I actually didn't, it actually wasn't consent. And then how do we care for ourselves after that?
Yeah, that's super important. And, certainly there are extreme circumstances, right, where you're going to want to have a lot of support outside of your own self. Um, but there's an awful lot we can do for and with ourselves. And I want to be really careful to say that, um, even though I want to focus on how how do we as individuals care for ourselves when we've experienced a rupture of agency, sovereignty, consent, um, that is by no stretch a holding of responsibility with the person who's experienced that rupture, right? Um, it's just that in our culture, a lot of the blowback for a rupture of consent comes back to the person who has experienced that rupture. We tend to, you know, kind of do the work of society at blaming our own selves. The shame is real. I wasn't clear in my communication. Maybe I shouldn't have done this thing. Maybe I, should have known better, or I should have known myself, or I should have said the thing. Um, and I think it's super important that we don't, do that work of oppression against our own selves. So I just want to name that first. Um, and I think there's a lot we can do to care for ourselves in the aftermath of that. And so maybe, if consent violations can be really subtle, it can be, I didn't know that I didn't want that. It can be, I had a feeling something was kind of off, but I didn't know what it was. So I didn't say anything.
Mm.
Or it could be, I knew I didn't want that, but I didn't know how to say it. Or I didn't feel safe to say it. And that could be like anything from like, I didn't think this person would react. I thought they might react violently to, I thought they might be disappointed. Disappointment, going back to what we just said about belonging, can feel like an existential threat to have your partner disappointed with you. For some of us, can feel like the worst thing that can happen. And so there's so many grades of consent violation. There's a lot of, opportunity for us to second guess that in the aftermath. I think the most important thing is that we take a little time, like let ourselves slow down with it and not know the answer right away to exactly what happened or why it happened, or even if it happened. Like just to recognize that you're having some sense of disruption is enough to take a little space for yourself to let your processing unfold at its own pace. It helps to kind of name a thing. I'm feeling a little unsettled. I'm not sure what that's about. I'm going to take some space and time to really think that through, even if that's just what you're saying to yourself. Like, doesn't necessarily mean that it's what you're saying to your partner. You have a lot of calculations to make around whether your partner is a person you can say that to, or whether you want to say it when it's still raw, or you want to wait a little bit till you know. So slowing down, I think, is a huge thing. Not pressuring yourself to know, or to have the words yet is a huge thing. And naming that you're in a process is a big one, important as well. I don't hear that. That's my mail.
Mm.
um, and so that's, I think, the starting place. And then, the second piece is to really tune in with what's happening in your body, and try to meet whatever that is. If your stomach's like churning, like, does it help to put your hand on it? Does it help to kind of rub it a little bit? Does a little heat? Do you need to go outside and be explosive in your movements? Do you have some like intensity you need to like move through your muscles and your bones by like running down the street or playing hockey or something, whatever that might look like. So trying to meet what's true. Is it, I need softness, I need to retreat, I need to like be gentle, I need to stretch, I need to like move intensely, and doing that thing with some care, right? It helps to kind of create a container so you don't just go so far that you lose yourself in it. So saying like, I'm going to run around the block, that's a thing, that's a container. Um, and so I think that's another piece of trying to notice what's in the body and meet that as it needs. And you can be experimental. You're not always going to get it right the first time, and that's okay. But finding some way to be present with your body, with whatever is happening. Um, and then, you know, having a little bit of a, I tend to think of it as like revolutionary attitude. But that's me. I tend to bring that to everything. And not letting yourself start that self-talk that's not helpful. So that looks a lot like noticing what patriarchy is saying, or noticing what white supremacy is saying, or capitalism or colonialism is saying. Like, are those my words, or are those my parents' words, my grandparents' words? Is that like the words of, some pop culture, social media thing? And stripping that out as much as you can, and treating yourself with grace and compassion and kindness as you would a friend, hopefully, right? Um, like we don't need to be our own oppressor. That's that's a really important thing to try to have as a centered piece in that moment. And then just see what unfolds, you know, and as it starts to unfold, name it. Like everything you kind of get to, just name it out. I say out loud, but sometimes just saying it in your own head is sufficient. But saying those things, you know, when you if you get to a point where you're like, yeah, actually, that was a no for me, and I feel violated. Doesn't have to be about the other person's intention or whether they're a good person. It can just be like, what's true for you? And start naming those things as you figure them out. It can help to journal. It can help to have a really trusted friend or a therapist to like be a sounding board for some of those things. And then you get to start to decide like what you want to do with that information in terms of your interactions with people. And that all that process could take 5 minutes for some things, and it could take 5 months for other things. Um, and so, you know, in that process, if you do have a partner that you really like trust and is, you know, able to receive um, more challenging communications, and great, like say, I'm in this process. It might take me a few minutes or it might take me a little while to figure it out, but I'm going to communicate with you as I'm able to. And just know that, like, we're still solid as I'm figuring this out. Or I might need a little bit more space than we're used to. Um, and if the person is not a person that you can trust with that kind of uncertainty or knowing, then you can think through what's important to you to be safe as you do that work. But you don't have to disclose your internal process at any point for any reason.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you
Yeah.
for sharing all. Yeah, that's so good. And it seems like the kind of common thread for all of these things and kind of living life
Yeah.
is really to slow down, create spaciousness, and to
Yeah.
really to just let things think, just allow things to have time. And the more I'm just practicing feeling
Mm,
into our bodies and the messages that our bodies give us, including noticing areas of numbness, right? Where we're
absolutely.
not feeling.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Like a null is not a yes and it's not a no. It could be anything, but you're not going to figure that out by blowing past it, and you're not going to figure that out by going fast. It might need to get some attention. You know, I think there's a general, you'll hear often people saying if it's not a fuck yes, it's a fuck no, which is true. And sometimes you can have like an I don't know, and maybe you're with somebody that you really trust that you can name, like, this is an I don't know for me. Can we explore that a little bit and see what happens? It's okay to be curious in that way and exploratory. What I tend to want to avoid is noticing a null or an I don't know and just saying like, like it's going to be fine. And then moving quickly into an experience that you don't really have time to process until afterwards. Um, there's so many fun things you can do without doing a thing you don't know if you're interested in or not. And so I always prefer a pivot.
Yeah. Oh, it makes me think of we're talking about research and they're all questions. You got to have a I don't know, or I don't have enough information, or,
Yeah,
sometimes it's just uncharted territory. So we don't even know how to judge it.
right.
Um, so let's see. And as we're kind of winding up here, I don't want to open up new cans of worms, but there was something else I was thinking. Oh, yeah. I guess the one more thing is thinking about spaciousness and feeling into our bodies, like I'm curious in your relationships, have folks gotten to know this kind of rhythm with you? So in other words, if we were to go back through the exercises you did with me,
Right.
and you and I have this established rhythm. So the first one you might have asked me, I probably would have, I would have done sort of like a body scan,
Yeah.
like and I guess maybe
Sure.
you can kind of get faster at body scans, right? Is
Yeah.
that how you operate in the world?
It can be, yeah, and it depends on like how new is this territory. There are some shorthand assumptions that you start to make with partners, which often works just fine. Every once in a while, you'll find something that is no longer a yes for you. And so I think that's kind of pulls you back towards like just being present in the moment. And if you notice something, and getting adept at noticing, first of all, and then if you notice something, just say like, hey, like I want to slow this down for just a second. Let me check in. And I think this is a really lovely thing to cultivate in your relationships, in our relationships, is um, like the ability to slow things down and have that not be like really disruptive. I think people always think of consent as this like big disruption, but you can kind of build in to the way you play with your partners. Things like, hey, I'm just gonna like, I just want to check with my body and see like, how is all of this feeling for me? Like you can say that in a not
Like in a
in
sexy
in
way.
a sexier way. Yeah. Um, and I think the other thing that's important to cultivate is the neutrality of no. Like when somebody tells me no, I'm excited. Like I know you better when you tell me no. You've revealed yourself to me in a more intimate way when you tell me no. Like that's all good shit, right? And so, um, you know, we're I think in a lot of relationships, no is like this big like it's upsetting. Not everybody feels comfortable with it. What does it mean? Does it mean that I'm rejected? Does it mean that like you're not happy with me? Like is our relationship solid? It can get really big, like outsized big, really fast. And so one of the things I love about embodied consent work, especially with couples, is getting to neutrality of no, that no is not this scary thing. It's actually like a super um, lovely kind of hot thing where you're like deepening the intimacy, deepening the knowing of each other. Like there's so much trust in no, and trust is pretty hot. Um, and so I think that's an important piece, to kind of cultivate with your partners.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And it's also making me think about how I feel like I've had experiences where I can almost be overly, like, is this okay? Is this okay? Is this okay?
Right.
And how sometimes like if it's not like, and that might be coming from too much the intellect,
Mm,
or coming from a place of fear.
yeah.
But how there's kind of like how can we be sexy about getting consent where there can still be,
Yeah.
you don't know everything that's going to happen, which can be exciting. So,
Right.
but it always seems like it comes down to
Mm,
if we move slower
mm.
and also
Yeah.
make time to allow that body that you're interacting
Right.
with kind of, I don't know, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, right. And like even when I was asking those questions, I was going a little fast. Like you may not have had time to really notice what your body was doing because we were like on a time frame. So I was condensing it a little bit. And sometimes I'll have clients take as long as it takes for them to notice what is happening in my body. And that could be a minute, it could be 10 minutes, it could be 20 minutes sometimes. Um, and also I'm just gonna say, like, I don't believe that all sex has to be slow, or that all conversations have to be slow. Like a fast, intense sex is fun. And I'm certainly not trying to take that off the table for folks. And, I think that we all get to have like a rich diversity of sexual experiences. And that's an important one to throw in every once in a while, if not all the time, if that's your thing. Um, and so I just want to, be clear that we get to have the ways that we like to do things. And it can be really useful to slow down in an absence of information or we're not entirely certain how we feel about it. So being experimental and exploratory, that is a good place to slow it down a little bit. And I think too, for folks who've had really significant violations of agency and bodily sovereignty, asking for every little thing as like an experiment can be really hard. Some people can't tolerate that at all. It's too much attention or focus, but it can also be pretty healing if the timing is right and the person feels comfortable enough. So there can be times when like asking for every little thing is its own kind of hot. I've heard some folks who are like, my body opened in a way that's never opened before because everything was a question that I got to answer. That's beautiful. You just kind of find your rhythm and you trust that, that it's gonna, if you're listening to your body and trying to be present with that, that you're gonna find your way through well.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jen. To kind of like wind us up or kind of
Mm.
wrap up, my final question is related to earlier when you were saying, I keep going back to canning with mom. I'm going to go can with mom, but this is what
Right.
I'm going to do for myself later. Do you have any
Yeah.
examples of things that you set up for yourself to care for yourself after something maybe you don't really
Yeah.
feel like doing?
Yeah. I mean, a big part for me is like I often will have like conversations with my body. So for me, often just like naming and acknowledging is almost enough a lot of times. But if it's a bigger thing, like if I go and do that canning with mom, not my mom, but if just to continue the example, and I noticed that I spent the whole hour like with my shoulders up here and super tense, then I'm also going to maybe try to like I'm going to notice that my body is really rigid and locked up, and I'm going to try and do some like loosening, practice. I might stretch my arms, I might do windmills with my arms, I might do something that tries to like counter that body, like that accumulation of bodily tension. Um, Sometimes it's that, I go do something that I really do enjoy that does give me a lot of pleasure. Sometimes I have to go to the woods about it and just sit with the trees for a little while if it's a really big, stressor. Um, but yeah, I think that's those my go-to is like naming the thing, acknowledging what I've done, without blaming myself or giving myself a lot of shit for it, and then trying to meet whatever is present in my body. And if it's a bigger thing than that, then I kind of pull in my resources, and that might be, um, acupuncture, therapy, like whatever the things are that work for me to try to like undo some damage.
It's making me think how sort of like the opposite of, you were talking about in the very beginning, how the
Mm.
capitalistic colonizer white supremacy thing is like,
Right.
you do what I tell you to do, body, or I'm
Yeah.
just going to ignore you, just do what I tell you. And,
Yeah.
but the other way of it's almost objectifying, but in like this honoring way of like, whoa, I've been given this incredible gift, this thing that I need to
Yeah.
take care of. So I love how you were like,
Mm.
sometimes I can notice I feel sick to my stomach because I'm nervous about something, and I can be like, oh, I'm sick to my stomach because I'm nervous about the thing. So, but like you were saying, but to put a heating pad on it, or to,
Yeah.
to just like really be like, okay, there's this thing, this beautiful gift that I'm caring for,
Right.
instead of just being like, oh, that's why it's that way, so it's not really that big of a deal. Well, it's feeling that way, so it needs care,
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I think that the switch really flipped for me. I was in PT physical therapy one day and I walked out, got in my car and started to cry because I was like, I've never been friends with my body. Like this poor thing has just been working so hard for so long and I neglect it all the time and I'm not friends with my body. And so I know like the ideal of a lot of the work we do is to try to integrate mind and body as like one. Um, and I think in parts work, internal family systems parts work, the ideal is to like work with all the parts until everybody feels resolved and then integrate into self, right? And I find it really useful to think of my body as almost its own entity within this ecosystem of me that I'm in relationship with. So I, in that case, is like my brain, because it's the part that's super chatty and has a lot to say. And so I tend to have conversation back and forth, and it helps me to be in relationship with my body if I do think of it as a little bit of like another self. Um, and so it's a little bit of a construct, and it just works for me. And other people might find it doesn't work for them, and that's okay. You find your own way to be in relationship, body to mind. But that's the one that is most effective for me because I'm more likely to be kind to somebody else than myself. And so if I think of my body as like, this this tenderness, that I have more tenderness towards it. And I think it's similar to like inner child work, right? It's really hard to be cruel to a, 4-year-old. And so sometimes that's a way for us to be nicer to ourselves if we think of that we're being nicer to our inner child. And I kind of do the same thing with my body.
I love that. I feel like I'm just starting to come into that where I feel like that works for me as well.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Mm.
Beautiful. Thank you so, Jen, and just thank you for
Thank
the work
you.
that you do.
Oh,
And
thanks.
it's just, yeah, it's incredible. And I've actually found out about you from my friend who lived in Eugene, who would take the train
Yeah.
to see you in Portland and come back
Yeah.
because, yeah, they love the work that you do so much and couldn't quite find it here. We need more folks like you doing
Yeah.
this work.
Yeah, I'm really lucky to have some folks who do travel up from Eugene. I'm always like impressed by the commitment to their own, curiosity and exploration. And there is a good community of folks up in Portland. Like we're lucky in this region. There aren't a lot of folks who do this work across the world, but we do have like a good little handful of folks in Portland who are doing really beautiful work. And so I always find if I'm not the right person for somebody, I have a good group of people I can refer folks to, and that feels like a privilege. I know that not a lot of my colleagues around the country have. So yeah, thank you for thanking me, and thanks for having me. It was really fun to have this conversation today.
Yeah, so fun. Yeah, I'm excited to re-listen to it.
Yeah,
And then
who knows
I'll,
what we said?
I know. And then I will put your website link and your
Yeah.
Instagram handle, and that's the best way to get in contact with you, correct?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
definitely. Website for sure. Instagram is will at least lead you there.
Okay. Okay. Sounds good. Thank
All
you
right.
again. Okay.
Thank you, Ronan.